There is a register in the Archives Nationales in Paris that lists every church bell confiscated from the city of Paris between August 1792 and the end of 1793. It is not a dramatic document, it is a bureaucratic one. Columns of church names, bell weights in livres, founding dates were known, the names of the agents who conducted the confiscations, the dates of transfer to the melting facilities. The dry accounting of a revolutionary government dismantling 8 centuries of sacred metalwork in the name of military necessity. The register lists 1,247 bells from Paris alone. I've been trying to find out what happened to them. The answer, which is in the Archives Nationales, in the records of the Committee of Public Safety, in the financial accounts of the arsenals at Douai and Strasbourg, and in a dozen departmental archives across France, is not what the official history of the bell confiscations describes. The official history says the bells were melted into cannons. The records say something considerably more complicated, and the complication is documented in enough detail across enough separate archives that the picture it produces is not a mystery. It is a scandal. A specific, named, financially documented scandal that the historiography of the French Revolution has never fully assembled into a single account. To understand what the register shows, you need to understand what the confiscation was. On July 23, 1792, the Legislative Assembly of France passed a decree ordering the confiscation of all bronze church bells in the Republic for melting into artillery. The decree was specific. Bells were to be inventoried, weighed, and transported to designated foundries where they would be cast into cannon. The process was to be overseen by local authorities under the supervision of the Committee of Public Safety. The justification was genuine. France was at war. The revolutionary armies needed artillery. Bronze was the primary material for cannon founding. The churches of France held an extraordinary concentration of bronze. Centuries of accumulated investment in bells that rang the hours, called the faithful, marked the dead. The largest bell in Notre Dame de Paris, the Emmanuel, weighed approximately 13 tons. A single large bell contained enough bronze for several cannon. The decree was ambitious in scale. France had approximately 40,000 parishes. Each parish had at least one bell. The larger churches had carillons of dozens. The total bronze in French church bells was estimated at the time at approximately 100,000 tons, enough to equip an army many times the size of the revolutionary forces actually in the field. What happened to those 100,000 tons is the question that the Archives Nationales can partially answer and cannot fully resolve. Now, I want to tell you about the Emmanuel. The Emmanuel bell of Notre Dame de Paris was cast in 1686, during the reign of Louis XIV. It weighed approximately 13,000 kilograms. It had been rung for coronations, for victories, for the deaths of kings. It was, by 1792, one of the most famous bells in Europe. The confiscation decree of July 1792 applied to it as to every other bell in France. An inventory agent arrived at Notre Dame in September 1792 to assess the bell for confiscation. The inventory record is in the Archives Nationales. The agent recorded the bell's weight, its founding date, its condition. He noted it for confiscation and transfer. The Emmanuel was not melted. It is still in Notre Dame today, or was before the 2019 fire. How it survived the confiscation that consumed thousands of other bells across France is a question the Archives Nationales answers in a specific and documented way. There was a provision in the confiscation regulations for bells of exceptional historical or artistic significance to be exempted from melting pending review by a committee of the National Assembly. The Emmanuel was exempted under this provision. What the archive also shows, and this is the detail that begins to complicate the official narrative, is that the exemption process was applied selectively, and the criteria for exemption were not consistently followed. Some bells of genuine historical significance were melted without review. Some bells of no particular historical distinction were exempted through a process that the Committee of General Security's own records describe as subject to irregularity. The word used in the official correspondence from the Committee of General Security, dated November 1792, is irregularity. The correspondence is in the Archives Nationales. The specific irregularities it describes involve payments made to exemption review agents, bells removed from confiscation lists after private approaches to officials, and discrepancies between the weights recorded in confiscation inventories and the weights recorded at the foundries where the bells were ostensibly delivered. Discrepancies between the confiscation weights and the foundry receipt weights. This is the detail I keep returning to. The confiscation system required two separate records: the inventory at the church, where the agent weighed the bell and recorded its weight, and the receipt at the foundry, where the arriving bronze was weighed again before melting. A bell that weighed 500 livres at the church should weigh 500 livres at the foundry. The difference in the records, documented in the foundry receipt books which are at the Archives de la Guerre in Vincennes, is not zero. Across the foundry records for the arsenal at Douai, which processed bells from northern France, the aggregate discrepancy between confiscation weights and foundry receipt weights for the period August 1792 to December 1793 is approximately 15%, not random scatter around zero, a consistent deficit in the same direction. The foundries received less bronze than the confiscation inventories said was sent. 15% of 100,000 tons is 15,000 tons. If the Douai discrepancy is representative of the national program, and the partial records from other arsenals that survive suggest it is, then approximately 15,000 tons of church bell bronze was inventoried, removed from churches, recorded as transferred to foundries, and never arrived. Where did it go? The answer is in the records. Not completely, not provably for every missing ton, but in enough specific documented instances that the mechanism is clear. Bronze was money. In 1792, with the assignat currency collapsing, with foreign exchange unavailable, with the revolutionary government unable to pay its suppliers in anything the suppliers trusted, bronze was among the most reliable stores of value available. A bell removed from a church and recorded as transferred to a foundry could be sold privately to a metal merchant, a foreign buyer, a sympathetic noble with assets to protect. The seller kept the cash. The foundry received a fraudulent weight receipt. The discrepancy entered the record as administrative error. This is documented in the prosecutions conducted by the Committee of General Security in 1793 and 1794. The prosecutions are in the Archives Nationales. They name specific agents, specific transactions, specific bells. The Committee of General Security investigated at least 40 separate cases of bell confiscation fraud between August 1792 and July 1794. 40 named cases. The actual scale of the fraud was, by the committee's own estimate, substantially larger than what the prosecutions captured. The Emmanuel survived because it was legally exempted. Thousands of other bells survived because they were hidden, protected by communities that resisted the confiscation, or simply never collected by agents who found other uses for their time in the public's bronze. The bells that disappeared into the fraud, removed from churches, recorded as sent, never arrived at the foundries. Those are the ones nobody has fully accounted for. The confiscation register is in the Archives Nationales. The foundry receipt books are at the Archives de la Guerre. The prosecution records are in the Archives Nationales. The discrepancy between what was taken and what was melted is in the gap between those three sets of records. I placed them on the same table. What the gap shows is not a mystery about acoustic technology or lost civilizations. It is the specific, documented story of how a revolutionary government's most ambitious resource mobilization program was hollowed out by the same corruption it was supposed to overcome. The bells are in the records, most of them anyway. The rest, the 15,000 tons, are in the gap. In October 1793, a bell founder named Jean-Baptiste Cavelier was arrested in Lille. The charge was counter-revolutionary conspiracy. The actual crime was more specific. Cavaliere had been buying confiscated church bells from the collection agents appointed by the departmental administration of the Nord, reselling them at a significant markup to Flemish metal merchants across the border in the Austrian Netherlands, and submitting fraudulent weight receipts to the arsenal at Douai, claiming that the bronze had been delivered for cannon founding. The investigation that led to Cavaliere's arrest is in the Archives Nationales, in the records of the Committee of General Security. It is 37 pages long. It names 12 accomplices, documents 11 specific transactions, and traces the movement of approximately 8,000 kilograms of bell bronze from 17 churches in the Nord department to metal merchants in Ghent, Bruges, and Antwerp. The investigation is specific about the mechanism. Collection agents appointed by the departmental administration were, in principle, supervised by representatives of the Committee of Public Safety. In practice, the supervision was inconsistent, the records were managed by the agents themselves, and the foundry receipt system depended on the honesty of the same people whose compliance it was supposed to verify. Cavaliere had identified this structural weakness early and exploited it systematically. His trial is also in the Archives Nationales. He was convicted in November 1793 and guillotined in January 1794. His assets, which included substantial cash and what the tribunal's inventory describes as various metal objects of unclear provenance, were confiscated by the Republic. Cavaliere was one of 40 named defendants in bell confiscation fraud cases prosecuted by the Committee of General Security. He was probably not the most significant. The prosecutions that resulted in acquittals, because the evidence had been managed by people with interests in the outcome, are harder to trace in the archive, but they are there. I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming, because this is the point where the story could be made to sound more conspiratorial than the evidence supports. I am not claiming that the bell confiscation program was designed to enable fraud. The decree of July 1792 was a genuine response to a genuine military necessity. I'm not claiming that most of the confiscated bells were fraudulently diverted. The foundry records, despite the aggregate discrepancy, show that enormous quantities of bell bronze were legitimately received and melted. What the records show is that a program of this scale, operating under wartime pressure, with inadequate supervision, and in an economic environment where bronze was worth substantially more than the paper currency the government was issuing, created specific opportunities for fraud that specific people exploited. The fraud is documented. The scale of the fraud is estimable from the aggregate discrepancy in the records. The mechanisms of the fraud are visible in the prosecution records. What the fraud means for the history of the confiscation is that the official account, all the bronze became cannons, all the cannons went to the armies, the revolution armed itself with the church's metal, is demonstrably incomplete. Some of the bronze became cannons, some became fraud. Some disappeared into a network of private transactions that the Committee of General Security was pursuing, but never fully mapped. Now I want to tell you about the hidden bells, because the hidden bells are documented in a different archive and tell a different part of the story. The bell confiscation created a resistance movement that is visible in the records of the departmental archives across France. Communities that had built their bells over generations, that had commissioned specific castings to honor specific events, that had bells inscribed with the names of donors going back to the 14th century, these communities did not always comply with the confiscation decree. The methods of resistance are documented in the reports of confiscation agents who encountered them. At the Archives départementales du Finistère in Quimper, there are agent reports from 1792 describing bells that had been removed from towers and buried before the agents arrived. The reports note the burial sites where the bells were subsequently found. In several cases, the agents' reports acknowledged that the bells they found were not all the bells that should have been present, based on earlier inventory records. Some had been buried in locations the agents never found. The Archives départementales de la Vendée contains similar records, with the added dimension that the Vendée's counter-revolutionary uprising of 1793 made confiscation enforcement almost impossible in much of the department. The bells that were buried or hidden before the uprising were, in many cases, never found by revolutionary agents. The Vendée uprisings ended the confiscation program in that department before it was complete. Across France, the departmental archives contain reports of hidden bells, buried bells, bells spirited away by sympathetic priests or noble families, bells rung in defiance of confiscation orders and then disappeared before the agents arrived. The scale of this resistance is not fully quantifiable because the records of what was hidden are, by definition, records created by people trying to avoid official documentation. But the agent reports that describe the resistance, the frustrated notes about bells that should have been there and were not, the investigations into communities that clearly knew where their bells were and were not saying, those records exist. Some of those bells have been found. Over the past 2 centuries, buried bells have been unearthed in French fields and cellars and churchyards, sometimes still bearing their founding inscriptions identifying them as products of the Revolutionary period's confiscation. The Musée du Moyen Âge in Paris holds several. Provincial museums across France hold more. The bells that were hidden and later recovered are documented in the museum acquisition records and in the academic literature on medieval and early modern bell founding. The bells that were hidden and not recovered, that are still in the ground somewhere in France, are documented only by their absence in the confiscation records and by the agent reports noting that expected bells were not present. I want to tell you about one specific bell because it makes the human scale of what was lost concrete in a way that aggregate numbers cannot. The Archives départementales de la Loire-Atlantique in Nantes holds the confiscation records for the Department of Loire-Inférieure, as it was called during the Revolution. Among those records is the inventory for the Church of Saint-Nicolas in Nantes, conducted in September 1792. The inventory records 3 bells. The largest was described as approximately 800 kilograms, cast in 1467, bearing an inscription identifying it as the gift of a local merchant family named Rézé. The founding inscription is transcribed in the inventory agent's report. The bell, cast in 1467, the bell that bore the name of a family that had paid for it 3 centuries before the Revolution. The bell that had been rung for 3 centuries of births, deaths, marriages, fires, floods, and the ordinary accumulated drama of a city's life. The inventory records it as confiscated. The foundry receipt records show no bell of that weight arriving at the designated facility in the period that follows. The bell is in the gap. Whether it was fraudulently diverted, hidden by the community and never recovered, or simply lost in the administrative chaos of a wartime confiscation program operating at national scale, the archive does not say. What the archive says is that a bell cast in 1467 was inventoried in 1792 and then disappeared from the record. 325 years of a city's acoustic history, gone in the gap between one document and another. This is what the competitive video about acoustic energy systems is gesturing toward without knowing it. There is something real in the towers of French cathedrals that the Revolution changed. Not crystalline resonance technology or continental frequency networks. Those are inventions. What is real is this. The churches of France contained centuries of accumulated craftsmanship, specific objects with specific histories, the material record of a civilization's relationship with time and community, and the marking of shared experience through sound. The Revolution melted a significant portion of that record. Some of it became canons, some became fraud, some is still in the ground. The archive documents all 3 outcomes, partially and imperfectly, in records that have been in the Archives Nationales and the departmental archives since the 1790s. What is genuinely mysterious about the French Revolution's bell confiscation is not what the competitive video claims. It is this. We know approximately how much bronze was taken. We know approximately how much became canons. The difference, the gap, is large enough to constitute one of the more significant unexplained disappearances of material culture in European history. Not acoustic technology, bell bronze, hundreds of tons of it, named in inventories, recorded as transferred, never arrived at the foundries. The Archives Nationales is at 11 Rue des Quatre Filles in Paris. The confiscation registers are in Series F/19, which covers religious affairs. The Committee of General Security Prosecution records are in Series F/7. The foundry receipt books are at the Archives de la Guerre at Vincennes in the series covering the arsenal accounts for 1792 to 1794. The departmental archives of the Loire Atlantique, the Finistère, the Vendée, and dozens of other departments hold the local confiscation records, agent reports, and resistance documentation that fill in the national picture with specific local detail. The Emmanuel bell survived. The bell cast in 1467 for the Church of Saint-Nicolas did not. 325 years of a city's memory went into a gap in the records, and the gap has been there since 1792. The Archives Nationales in Paris holds the confiscation registers for the Bell program in Series F/19, the Committee of General Security Prosecution records in Series F/7, and the broader Committee of Public Safety records in Series AF/2. Finding aids are available through the Archives Nationales online catalog at archives.nationales.culture.gouv.fr. The Archives de la Guerre at Vincennes holds the Arsenal Foundry receipt books for the 1792 to 1794 period. These are the records that document the discrepancy between the weights recorded at confiscation and the weights received at the foundries. The departmental archives of France, the Archives départementales, are the repositories for local confiscation records, agent reports, and resistance documentation. Each department's archive is independently organized. Finding aids vary. The Musée du Moyen Âge in Paris holds several bells recovered from burial sites in France, with acquisition records documenting their discovery and identification as confiscation-era survivals. The gap between the confiscation registers and the foundry receipts is in the Archives Nationales. It has been there since 1794. No one has assembled the two sets of records into a single systematic account of what the discrepancy represents. The bells that never became cannons are in that gap. Some of them are still in the ground. Subscribe, because next week we open another file.